Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm here today under protest. Becky Dettmers was supposed to give this presentation. Becky's from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, but she apparently has important matters to deal with in Ottawa today. So you're stuck with me to listen to about grass carp. I'm here to report on the DFO-led risk assessment, the ecological risk assessment for grass carp in the Great Lakes Basin. There's also an accompanying socioeconomic assessment for grass carp that will be conducted after this has been released, so they needed this information. That's not complete yet. And so what I'm going to talk about today is essentially the background and process associated with the risk assessment, and then the results that essentially run through sort of the elements of the process of arrival, establishment, survival, spread, and the ecological consequences, and then the overall risk. So this evaluation was initiated by DFO's Asian Carp program. It's a binational program with a writing team that you see listed here on the slides. And then it was also informed by a variety of contributors to scope out the scale of the risk assessment, research conducted to inform the risk assessment, and also an independent peer review process. And those people were from federal, state, provincial agencies in the Great Lakes Basin, as well as academic institutions. The risk assessment was released in January of 2017, just a couple of months ago. If you have not seen it, I will tell you that it's in an importantly located place on the CSAS website, and so your best bet to find it is to either contact me and I'll send you the links, or Google binational grass carp risk assessment, and that will get it to you probably as easily as anything. So what's the purpose here of this risk assessment? It's to provide a binational and science-based assessment of the current level of risk and its associated uncertainty to the Great Lakes, and then transfer that information to inform decisions around the management and prevention of grass carp. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen a series of processes here. You'll note a couple of things. First of all, we're talking both about triploid and diploid animals, or sterile and fertile animals. So what you do is you determine what's the probability those fish can arrive, survive. In the case of fertile individuals, will they establish and reproduce, and then spread among lakes. We also look at what's the magnitude of ecological consequences of those fish, and then determine the overall risk to the Great Lakes, as well as the uncertainty. So that's the general process. And then what the writing team did was interact with a variety of folks to scope out the scale of the questions. And this is essentially what the managers told us was important to consider. Consider both sterile and fertile grass carp. Think about the entire Great Lakes Basin, but also do it on a lake-by-lake basis, because that lake-by-lake discrimination is important for management decision-making. Think about risks out on timescales of 5, 10, 20, and 50 years from point certain, which for us was 2014. So that was our baseline of information. And an important caveat here, it's just important for all of you to know that when we talk about risk here, that's assuming no new risk management activities by agencies into the future. So that's essentially how we get this risk 5, 10, 20, or 50 years into the future. So let's look at some key findings here, starting with arrival. The first and rather sobering piece of news is that grass carp has arrived into the Great Lakes Basin. The invasion process absolutely has begun in lakes Michigan, Erie, and Ontario. In all three of those places, the invasion process has started for fertile grass carps and for sterile grass carps in lakes Michigan and Erie. In addition, the risk assessment says that the most direct the most likely direct point of arrival for sterile and fertile grass carp is through the Chicago area waterway system on Lake Michigan. That's for the direct physical connections here. The most likely vector of arrival for Lake Erie is human-mediated release and some unknown combination of bait for sterile grass carp and stocking into the watershed for fertile grass carp. The likelihood of arrival itself is lower for Lakes Ontario, Superior, and Huron. And then if we think about survival, I think there's just really no question here. There are no barriers to survival to grass carp across the Great Lakes Basin. There's plenty of food and thermal habitat across all 5 Great Lakes for overwinter survival. We don't believe predation and disease are limiting factors. And in fact, we couldn't find any known factors to preclude survival of these fishes in the Great Lakes. In terms of establishment, we note that both suitable spawning and nursery habitat is present in each of the Great Lakes. This is confirmed by both Canadian and U.S. research. Positive trajectory population growth is expected to occur and requires few individuals if older age classes are introduced to establish that sort of a self-reproducing positive trajectory population growth curve. There's no known impediment to survival of early life stages, although the overwinter survival of young of year is somewhat less probable in northern latitudes depending on exactly where you are. So that might be a bit of good news for Lake Superior. The likelihood of establishment is very likely within 10 years for Lakes Erie, Michigan, Huron, and Ontario, although the likelihood of establishment for Lake Superior remains low out to the 50-year time horizon. It's also important to note here that we don't expect sterile grass carp to establish populations. The author team said that outcome is very unlikely with high certainty. In terms of spread, which is the movement of fish from one lake to another, spread to other Great Lakes in the basin is a concern based on arrival to Lakes Michigan and Erie, and especially because fish can pass directly and freely throughout those 3 lakes, among Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie. Movement is certainly influenced by habitat and food availability, especially across those 3 central lakes. And following introduction into a single lake, again based on modeling results, grass carp are expected to spread to other lakes within 5 to 10 years, and the risk from spread into a system is greatest for Lake Huron. Come back. Movement between Lakes Huron and Superior is possible, and movements between Erie and Ontario, while possible, are less likely, and that's due to the lock and dam structures that regulate both those connections. Okay, so in terms of ecological consequences, there are substantial reductions in what we call peak submerged aquatic vegetation are predicted here. So the effect of grass carp is going to be reducing that submerged aquatic vegetation. Adult grass carp are herbivorous. They would not compete directly with most Great Lakes fishes, although larval and juvenile forms of grass carp up into that first month and a half, 2 months of life will compete because they do eat invertebrates. Consumption of grass carp, consumption of submerged aquatic vegetation by grass carp may lead to a variety of consequences to the biotic community. And we had access to some very interesting research done by DFO scientists to look at the potential impacts of fish. And essentially that study concluded that 66 of the 136 Great Lakes fishes that they examined could experience high or moderate negative consequences if grass carp were to establish. And some of those species, certainly not an exhaustive list, include largemouth bass, northern pike, bowfin, and walleye. We also looked at the potential impacts to birds, And interestingly, here we had data for birds on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes. And 37 of the 47 birds in that list could experience high or moderate negative consequences. And that's associated, again, with a combination of habitat available as they may be migrating, as well as nesting. So you get, resident birds that will be there during the summer, like soar, at least bittern, but also mallards, canvasbacks, things like that. So there's some really extensive potential consequences here associated with grass carp invasion. Well, let me talk a little bit about how all of this gets rolled up into the overall risk assessment. So the first thing here is that we have the probability of introduction along the y-axis ranging from at the bottom very unlikely to very likely, and then the magnitude of ecological consequences along the x-axis ranging from negligible to extreme. And then it's just a gradient of risk ranging from green, meaning pretty low risk, to getting into really serious or extreme risk conditions. So those are then combined, those two elements are combined into this overall risk matrix. The ellipse that you see around the point denotes sort of the level of certainty around the data for each axis. And again, this was assessed at those time intervals that managers thought would be important at 5, 10, 20, and 50 years into the future. So let me first show you the data for sterile or triploid grass carp. The probability of occurrence is very likely up here for Lakes Michigan and Erie, but the ecological consequences are negligible for all lakes and all time periods. So that means that the overall risk here is low because we're generally in this green area because of even though there could be very likely presence of triploid grass carp, ecological consequences are predicted to be low. Situation becomes much different for diploid or fertile grass carp. Certainly the overall risk is low for all lakes at 5 years, but the overall risk increases to high for Lake Ontario and extreme for Lakes Michigan, Erie, and Huron 50 years out into the time horizon. Lake Superior remains at low risk throughout the 50-year time horizon. So that's essentially the nuts and bolts, the key messages here of the risk assessment. Summing it all up, Lakes Erie and Michigan are at greater risk relative to the other lakes for grass carp invasion. If the rate of arrival increases for some reason, the onset and magnitude of risk will increase. Regulations and enforcement of regulations are two really important factors that may affect the likelihood of arrival to the other lakes in the basin. Ecological consequences are relative to the invasion process. Consequences increase with abundance, so it's therefore really important to prevent introduction and establishment whenever and wherever possible when you're thinking about this particular invasive fish. Immediate preventative actions would be most effective, especially in conjunction with management activities where grass carp has arrived, in order to reduce the probability of establishment and delay or reduce subsequent ecological consequences. And with that, I will stop the formal presentation and see if any of you have any questions.